Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of shows, but nothing prepared him for this moment. In the middle of live television, he froze, forgetting the cameras, the audience, and even his script. Why? Because Keanu Reeves had just said something about Jesus so powerful it left the world holding its breath. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The studio lights burned bright, the audience clapped in rhythm, and the cameras rolled without a hitch. Family Feud had always been a place of laughter, of lighthearted competition, of Steve Harvey's quick wit and booming humor filling every corner of the set. But on this night, something happened that no one in the room could have anticipated. Steve Harvey stood at his podium, one hand resting on the edge, the other gripping a cue card. His laughter had been echoing seconds earlier, stirring the crowd, energizing the moment. Then it stopped. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes fixed not on the monitors, not on the cheering contestants, but on the man standing quietly at the podium opposite him, Keanu Reeves. The silence was instant and sharp. It wasn't the usual pause between jokes or the lull before another question. It was the kind of silence that presses down on a room, that forces every person in the audience to lean forward in their seats, wondering if something had gone wrong. But nothing was wrong. Something far greater was unfolding. Steve's entire career had been built on timing when to crack the joke, when to hold the punchline, when to move the conversation forward. He had mastered it. Yet in this moment, timing abandoned him. The cue card in his hand might as well have been blank. His thoughts were gone, his rhythm broken. For the first time in years, Steve Harvey, the man known for filling every second with a word or a laugh, had nothing to say. What froze him wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't nerves. It was a single sentence, a line spoken by Keanu Reeves in his steady, almost whispering voice. Keanu hadn't shouted it. He hadn't even said it like a declaration. He spoke the words like he carried them in his chest, like they were a truth he had lived through pain and struggle. His eyes had been gentle when he said it, but there was fire underneath, a conviction that reached past the cameras and into the soul of anyone listening. In that quiet moment, Keanu had spoken about Jesus not as a distant figure or an untouchable legend, but as someone real, someone alive, someone who still walked with him. The words pierced the noise of television, cutting through the laughter and applause that usually defined the show. For Steve, it was as if the world around him blurred, the cameras became background, and the only thing left in sharp focus was Keanu Reeves and the truth he had just released into the room. The audience sensed it too. Their clapping slowed, their cheers softened, and then the hush settled over them like a wave. Hundreds of people in the studio who had come for games and jokes now sat wide-eyed, as if pulled into something far deeper than entertainment. Behind the cameras, a producer's voice cracked through the headset. "Steve, keep moving. We're still live." The words were calm, almost pleading. But Steve didn't move. He couldn't. His hands clenched the podium tighter. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. Every second stretched into eternity. For a host who thrived on flow, this was dangerous. A pause this long on live TV was unheard of. It could ruin a segment, break the energy, cause confusion. But in this moment, nobody cared. The audience wasn't restless. They weren't impatient. They were captivated. Keanu didn't fidget. He didn't smile nervously or try to fill the space. He stood still, his posture calm, his gaze soft, almost unaware of the ripple his words had created. The faintest trace of a smile touched his lips, not a grin of confidence, but the quiet expression of a man who had said what needed to be said and left it at that. Steve's chest rose and fell, heavier now, as if the weight of the statement had landed squarely on him. His eyes flicked once toward the crowd, then back to Keanu. What he saw wasn't a Hollywood star basking in applause. He saw a man who carried a peace he couldn't explain. The audience leaned forward, their silence louder than any laughter. Every camera in the studio stayed trained on the two men, capturing a moment that no one had scripted. The staff, usually bustling in the background, had slowed their movements. Even those who weren't supposed to be watching were watching, unable to pull their attention away. In the middle of a game show meant for fun and comedy, something holy had slipped in. It was undeniable. Steve Harvey, the entertainer, the comedian, the host, was no longer in control of the moment. Something else was. And for the first time in his long career, he didn't want to wrestle it back. He wanted to listen. The cameras continued to roll, the countdown lights blinking softly in the corner, but no one seemed to notice. All eyes were on Steve, waiting for him to break the silence. Normally, he thrived under pressure. He knew how to twist an awkward pause into comedy gold. But this was different. This wasn't awkward. This was weighty. Sacred, even. Steve's mind replayed the words Keanu had just spoken, simple yet shattering. It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't dressed up in performance. It was raw, lived-in truth. And that truth had reached into Steve's chest, pulling at something he had long buried beneath layers of humor and routine. For the first time, Steve wasn't worried about ratings or audience reactions. He wasn't even worried about the producers signaling frantically from behind the cameras. He was simply locked in, staring at Keanu like a man trying to understand how another person could carry that kind of piece. The audience could feel the tension, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was magnetic. Every breath in the room seemed synchronized, as if the entire studio had leaned forward together, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, almost imperceptibly, Steve's shoulders dropped. The booming presence of the host slipped away. What stood there wasn't a showman. It was a man, caught in a moment of revelation. "Steve," came the quiet voice of the floor manager, urging him to continue. But Steve Harvey didn't move. He couldn't move. The world might have been watching a game show, but for Steve, for the audience, for the crew, this was no game. This was something else, something eternal, breaking into the ordinary. The audience shifted in their seats, not with impatience, but with wonder. A game show wasn't supposed to feel like this. Yet no one wanted to break the spell. A mother in the front row reached for her child's hand, sensing this was more than television. A cameraman, normally stone-faced during shoots, felt his throat tighten as he zoomed in on Steve's expression. Keanu remained still, his eyes steady but kind, the faint smile never leaving his lips. He didn't rush to explain, didn't try to soften what he had said. He simply let the silence carry it, trusting that truth didn't need an echo to make its presence known. Steve Harvey, who had built a career on words, suddenly realized he was standing in a moment that no punchline could save and no script could guide. He glanced down at his cue card, but the ink seemed meaningless now. His entire body felt frozen, as if the weight of Keanu's words had pressed into his chest and demanded stillness. The producer whispered again through the earpiece, but Steve hardly heard it. He could feel something rising in the room, something unseen, yet undeniable. It wasn't tension, it was presence. Then, in the silence, Steve drew a slow breath, his lips parting as though he might finally speak. The audience leaned forward, hearts pounding, waiting for his next word. But nothing came. The cameras kept rolling, capturing what no one had planned. The moment a Hollywood star's quiet conviction stopped one of America's most confident hosts cold, leaving an entire nation wondering what could possibly happen next. Atlanta in late afternoon shimmered under the kind of heat that clings to your skin and makes the air itself feel alive. The city hummed with its usual rhythm traffic rolling steadily outside, horns honking in bursts, people moving in and out of restaurants and corner shops. But inside the Family Feud studio, the rhythm was very different. It was sharper, faster, fueled by adrenaline and expectation. Producers barked orders through headsets as stagehands moved across the floor with precision, checking cables and tape marks. Camera operators adjusted their angles while assistants scurried about carrying stacks of papers, clipboards, and water bottles. The hum of machinery blended with the murmur of audience chatter as people filed into their seats, buzzing with the kind of excitement only a live taping can generate. Family Feud had seen countless productions before, but tonight felt different. Not chaotic, not calm somewhere in between. a tense balance of electricity and routine. Everyone knew their role, but everyone also knew this wasn't just any episode. This was a celebrity special, and celebrity specials always meant a little more pressure. Backstage, Steve Harvey was in his usual rhythm. He stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time, chuckling at himself as he cracked a joke to the makeup artist standing nearby. His voice, deep and familiar, carried across the room, warming up like an instrument before a concert. He had done this thousands of times before, and yet every show still carried its own pulse. "Let's make them laugh till they forget what day it is," Steve said with that wide smile he wore like armor. The makeup artist laughed, shaking her head. She had heard countless lines like that before, but it still carried Steve's trademark energy. He glanced at the stack of cards in his hand, the names, the categories, the flow of the show carefully arranged in print. Each card was part of a formula he knew by heart. The show worked because it was structured chaos, and he was the master conductor. But tonight, one card drew his eyes more than the others. He read the name once, twice, and then again. Keanu Reeves. Steve had met countless celebrities, some larger than life, some humbled by the weight of fame. But Keanu carried a reputation that didn't quite fit in Hollywood's usual mold. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. People spoke of him with a strange reverence about his humility, his kindness, his almost mysterious calm. It was the kind of reputation Steve rarely trusted until he saw it himself. "Keanu Reeves," Steve murmured under his breath, the name rolling slowly, as though he were trying to measure it. He expected charm, of course. Keanu had built an image in the public eye as a movie star, beloved across generations. But what Steve didn't expect, what he couldn't yet know, was that beneath the surface of Hollywood legend lay something deeper, something that would reach across a game show stage and change the atmosphere entirely. The crowd outside the studio doors was let in, row by row, filling the seats with energy that quickly began to echo off the walls. Excitement buzzed like static in the air as ushers guided families, couples, and fans into their spots, reminding them to clap and cheer when the red applause light lit up above the stage. For many, this was more than just an afternoon outing. It was a chance to be part of something bigger, a story to tell when they got home. Steve Harvey had always fed off that energy. The rhythm of audience laughter was the lifeblood of Family Feud, and he knew how to conduct it better than anyone. He could take a pause and stretch it into a roar of laughter, or lean into a contestant's awkward answer and turn it into a viral moment. Tonight, though, his usual spark carried something heavier. He flipped through his cards again, though he knew the categories by heart. It wasn't the questions he was thinking about. It was the guests. The two celebrity teams had been carefully chosen, one group of country gospel singers, full of joyful spirit, and the other, a mix of Hollywood actors with roots in action films. The balance was perfect for TV, music, film, personality. Yet Steve's focus returned again and again to one name on the list, Keanu Reeves. The man's presence alone fascinated him. Not because of his fame, Steve had shared stages with stars for decades. But there was something different about the stories he'd heard. Whispers that followed Keanu wherever he went. People spoke of subway rides where he offered his seat to strangers, quiet donations made without publicity, grief carried in silence, kindness given without cameras. Backstage, Steve watched as crew members prepped the contestants. Some celebrities joked loudly, filling the room with energy as they shook off nerves. Others scrolled on their phones, pretending not to care. But Keanu was different. He sat quietly in a folding chair, posture relaxed, his hands folded loosely in his lap. No phone, no chatter, no need to perform. He simply observed, present, without demanding space. Steve tilted his head, studying him. Most guests radiated nerves before stepping into the spotlight, their voices a little louder, their laughter forced. Keanu seemed to carry none of that. He wasn't aloof, but he wasn't grasping for attention either. He existed in a kind of stillness that unsettled Steve in ways he couldn't name. The host cracked another joke to a nearby stagehand, drawing laughter that rippled through the hallway. But even as he laughed, His eyes flicked back to Keanu. Something about that calm presence tugged at him, quiet but insistent, like a whisper under the noise. Steve had expected charisma, maybe a few polite answers, maybe even a surprise punchline if Keanu decided to play along. What he hadn't expected was this strange pull, this sense that the man carried something deeper than Hollywood polish. And the show hadn't even started yet. The countdown clock above the stage ticked closer to showtime. Crew members moved with quick precision, securing microphones to collars, testing lights, and making last adjustments to the glossy podiums that gleamed under the heat of the studio lamps. The buzz of anticipation grew louder with each passing second. Steve Harvey usually thrived in this stretch of time. He liked to banter with the crew, toss playful lines to the stage manager, or crack jokes at his own expense. It relaxed him, gave the staff a laugh, and set the tone for the show. But tonight, his focus was slipping. His thoughts kept circling back to the quiet man sitting a few feet away. Keanu had been fitted with his microphone already. The technician had clipped it to his shirt and tested the audio, but Keanu barely moved, nodding politely and thanking the crew member with quiet sincerity. Once the technician left, he folded his hands again, sitting still, almost contemplative. He didn't fidget, didn't pace, didn't scroll through a phone. He simply breathed in the moment as though he were preparing for something greater than a game show. Steve found himself adjusting his tie again, though it was already straight. Something about Keanu's presence unsettled him, not in a negative way, but in a way that stirred questions he couldn't shake. How could a man who had seen the heights of fame sit so humbly in a folding chair backstage, unaffected by the chaos around him? The warm-up comedian entered the stage, priming the audience with jokes, getting them laughing and clapping on cue. Applause echoed through the walls, a reminder that in moments, Steve would step out into the spotlight, the host once again. Normally, that thought filled him with adrenaline, a thrill that never dulled no matter how many episodes he taped. But tonight, he caught himself glancing at Keanu one last time, wondering silently what it was about him that drew such gravity. A stagehand signaled Steve toward the wings. He nodded, slipping into his usual confident stride, but his thoughts were anything but routine. The laughter from the audience washed over him, yet behind it, something deeper pulsed a sense that the night would be unlike any other. Steve whispered under his breath, almost to himself, Keanu Reeves. The name wasn't just a card in his hand anymore. It was a presence he could feel, one that promised to turn an ordinary taping into something unforgettable. The floor manager called out, 30 seconds to showtime. The lights flared brighter, the theme music swelled through the speakers, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Steve Harvey took his place at the podium, smile wide, voice ready to boom. Yet inside, he carried a question he hadn't yet spoken out loud. What was it about Keanu Reeves that felt so different? In just a few minutes, he would find out. The minutes before showtime had always been a ritual for Steve Harvey. He would shake a few hands, exchange jokes with the crew, loosen his shoulders, and slip into the rhythm that made him the host America loved. But tonight, as he stepped into the hallway, lined with bright bulbs and the muffled echoes of the audience, his eyes landed on the one man he hadn't yet greeted. Keanu Reeves stood near the edge of the room, away from the chatter of the other celebrities. He wasn't stiff, but there was a stillness about him that made the chaos around him seem less noisy. His hands rested casually at his sides, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze steady. He was present without trying to be noticed, and somehow, that made him stand out all the more. Steve walked over, a grin spreading across his face, determined to set the tone with the humor that always came naturally. "Man," Steve said as he extended his hand, "I feel like you could stare straight into my soul and still be kind about it." The room chuckled, a few crew members shaking their heads at Steve's ability to crack a line anywhere, anytime. But Keanu didn't just laugh, he let out a soft, genuine chuckle, one that wasn't forced for the cameras. He clasped Steve's hand with a warmth that surprised him. The handshake wasn't too firm, not showy, but grounded, steady. "Wouldn't recommend soul staring," Keanu replied gently, his voice carrying a quiet humor of its own. "But kindness that I can try to live with." Steve tilted his head, intrigued. There was no bravado in the answer, no attempt to one-up the joke, just a calm sincerity that felt heavier than the words themselves. For a man who thrived on punchlines and quick wit, Steve found himself momentarily at a loss for how to keep the banter rolling. He studied Keanu for a moment longer. There was no rush in his movements, no flicker of nervous energy. Instead, Keanu's presence carried something almost grounding, as though he belonged to another rhythm entirely slower, deeper, untouched by the frantic pulse of television production. Steve broke the pause with another grin, patting Keanu on the shoulder as if to shake off the strange weight in the air. Well, brother, you're about to walk into a room that's loud, wild, and full of folks expecting to laugh. Just letting you know, ain't nothing quiet about Family Feud. Keanu nodded, his eyes kind, but carrying a depth that made Steve pause again. Noise doesn't bother me, Keanu said softly. It's what people carry underneath it that matters. Steve blinked, the words landing heavier than he expected. It was supposed to be a casual greeting, a moment to loosen the air before cameras rolled. Instead, he felt as though a door had opened into something more, and he wasn't sure he was ready to walk through it. For the first time in years, Steve Harvey realized that maybe the most interesting thing happening on this set tonight wasn't going to be the jokes, the applause, or even the game itself. It might just be the man standing quietly in front of him. The laughter from the warm-up comedian carried faintly through the hallway, mixing with the clapping of the audience. Normally, that sound would pump Steve up like a drumbeat, his cue to step into the spotlight and dominate the stage. Tonight, though, it faded into the background. What stood out instead was the quiet man in front of him. Steve folded his arms, leaning against the wall like he always did when he wanted to appear casual, but inside he wasn't relaxed. Something about Keanu's presence made it hard to slip into his usual flow. The man wasn't flashy, he wasn't demanding, yet somehow he filled the room. "You always this calm?" Steve asked, breaking the silence with a smile. "Because if I had your career, I'd be bouncing off these walls like a kid on Christmas morning." Keanu gave a small laugh, his head tilting slightly, as if he were considering the question with more weight than Steve intended. "Calm comes after storms," he said simply. "When you've seen enough of them, you learn the noise isn't what lasts." Steve's smile wavered. He had expected a quip, maybe something self-deprecating. Instead, Keanu's words felt like they carried history, like they came from a man who had lived through fires most people never even glimpsed. For a second, Steve thought about the storms in his own life, the nights he prayed before walking onto a stage, the times laughter was his only shield against doubt. He pushed the thought away quickly, masking it with another grin. "Well," Steve said, "I hope you're ready, because the noise out there ain't no storm, it's a full-on hurricane when those folks get to hollering." Keanu smiled politely, his eyes steady, almost reflective. "Then maybe they need more than just noise tonight," he said quietly. Steve felt his chest tighten, and he wasn't sure why. He was the professional here. He had commanded stages for decades, entertained millions, yet standing in front of Keanu Reeves, with nothing but a hallway between them, he suddenly felt like the student, not the master. A stagehand rushed past, calling out reminders, jolting Steve back into the moment. He straightened his tie again, buying time. Keanu didn't move, didn't shift his weight nervously, didn't try to fill the silence. He simply existed in it, and that unsettled Steve more than any loud personality ever could. For a man like Steve Harvey, silence was usually a threat. It meant he had to rescue the moment with laughter. But here, in Keanu's presence, silence felt different. It wasn't awkward, it was steady, it was alive. And Steve couldn't shake the feeling that the calm man beside him carried something deeper than charm, deeper than fame. Something he couldn't yet put into words, but something he desperately wanted to understand. The call came from down the hallway. 2 minutes to showtime. Crew members began to hustle, their voices louder now, their movements quicker as the countdown pressed in. Normally, Steve would be firing jokes, loosening everyone up, keeping the atmosphere light before the curtain rose, but instead he lingered near Keanu, caught in the quiet pull of the man's presence. He tried again to break the weight of the moment. You know, most folks walking into a place like this, they carry nerves, or at least a little swagger. But you're just sitting here like it's Sunday morning at a coffee shop. Keanu's lips curved into the faintest smile. His eyes were calm, steady, as if they could see past the layers people wore in public. Maybe that's all it really is, he said softly. Just another morning, another chance to be present. Steve blinked. There it was again, that unsettling mixture of simplicity and depth. Words that sounded ordinary at first, but lingered in the chest long after. He gave a half laugh, shaking his head. Man, I don't even know what to do with you yet. They both chuckled, but Steve could feel the difference between their laughter. His carried the familiar spark of performance, trained and polished from years of entertainment. Keanu's laugh, though quiet, carried no performance at all. It was simply honest, free of effort. The stage manager motioned urgently now, pointing Steve toward the wings. He nodded, but before turning away, he glanced at Keanu one last time. And in that glance, something shifted. He caught a look in Keanu's eyes, not pride, not nerves, but kindness threaded with something deeper, almost like sorrow and hope existing together. It was the kind of look that made a man pause, even in the busiest moment of his career. Steve felt a chill run up his arms despite the heat of the lights. It wasn't fear. It wasn't intimidation. It was recognition, though he couldn't yet name of what. He only knew this: Keanu Reeves wasn't just another guest star. And whatever was about to unfold on that stage would not be ordinary. The hallway door opened, spilling light across the floor. The roar of the audience swelled as the theme music blasted from the speakers. Steve adjusted his jacket, plastered on the trademark smile he had worn for decades, and prepared to step out. But deep down, something inside whispered that tonight's show wouldn't belong to him. He glanced back once more at Keanu. The man stood with quiet grace, nodding politely as if to say he was ready. Ready for what? Steve didn't yet know, but he felt it. Something was coming. And in that small moment before stepping onto the stage, Steve Harvey, who always knew what to expect, who always controlled the room, realized he was walking into a night he would never forget. The stage lights blazed to life, flooding the set in gold and white. The audience erupted in cheers as the theme music thundered through the speakers. Steve Harvey stepped onto the stage with his usual larger-than-life energy, smiling wide, hands outstretched as if embracing the entire crowd. His voice boomed across the studio, warm and commanding, every syllable landing with practiced precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Family Feud," he shouted, drawing a roar of applause. He grinned, feeding off the excitement, letting the familiar rhythm steady his nerves. The cameras panned across the cheering audience, catching faces full of laughter and anticipation. For Steve, this was his world, the place where his humor, timing, and presence transformed strangers into one family for an hour at a time. He launched into his usual banter, tossing jokes at the crowd, playing off their laughter like a jazz musician riffing on a melody. "Y'all better be ready tonight," he teased, pacing across the stage. "We got celebrities in the house, and trust me, they didn't come to play, they came to win." The audience clapped louder, stomping, their feet in rhythm. Steve chuckled, savoring the moment. His voice carried like a wave, filling every corner of the studio. He began introducing the two teams with energy, each name punctuated by applause and cheers. The country gospel singers drew whistles and shouts from fans in the crowd. The actors on the opposing side earned laughter and excitement. Each introduction was smooth, every beat hitting exactly where Steve wanted it, until he reached one name. And now, Steve paused, looking down at his card, though he didn't need to. The name had already been carved into his thoughts, long before this moment. He lifted his gaze, smiling as he turned toward the next podium. "You know him from, well, just about everything. Please welcome Keanu Reeves." The room erupted in applause, but what followed wasn't the usual chaos of whistles, shouts, and laughter. Keanu stepped forward slightly, offering no dramatic entrance, no exaggerated wave. Instead, he raised one hand in a gentle greeting, his expression humble, his smile soft and unassuming. The shift was immediate. The applause didn't vanish. It softened. The whistles faded, replaced by something quieter, almost reverent. The audience leaned forward, not cheering louder, but watching more closely. The energy, once wild and playful, slowed to something calmer, weightier. Steve blinked, thrown off for a split second. He recovered quickly, tossing out a line with his signature grin. "Now hold on. This man don't even need an introduction. His name walked in before he did." The crowd chuckled politely, but it wasn't the usual rolling laughter that Steve could count on. The air was different, thicker somehow. He adjusted his tie, his rhythm faltering just enough for him to notice. Something about Keanu's simple wave and quiet smile had shifted the atmosphere. It wasn't nerves, it wasn't awkwardness, it was something else. Something that made Steve feel as though the spotlight had moved in a way he couldn't quite explain. Steve kept the smile fixed on his face, but inside he felt the shift. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable. He was used to controlling a room with ease, to pulling laughter out of the air as naturally as breathing. But after Keanu's quiet wave, the rhythm of the show didn't quite match his stride. He launched into the first few questions with his usual booming voice, but when he dropped the punchline, the crowd's laughter didn't explode the way it normally did. It was softer, more measured. They still smiled, they still clapped, but something held them back. Steve glanced at the audience, puzzled. His jokes hadn't lost their sharpness, his timing hadn't slipped, not yet. But he noticed something in their eyes. They weren't distracted, they weren't restless. They were looking past him, glancing often toward the man at the podium, who had said nothing more than hello. Keanu stood with his hands resting gently on the podium, not shifting his weight nervously like most contestants, not looking for attention. His presence wasn't demanding, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that changes the air in a room. Steve tried again, leaning into a contestant's funny answer, milking it with exaggerated expressions, the way he always did to make the crowd howl. Normally, the laughter would have rolled like thunder. Tonight, it trickled, polite and brief. Before the silence settled again, he cleared his throat, tugging at his jacket sleeve, his mind racing. This had never happened before. A studio audience was easy to read, easy to guide. But tonight, the atmosphere wasn't following his lead. Something else was steering it. He turned his gaze briefly toward Keanu. The man hadn't said a word since his introduction. He simply smiled faintly at the contestant across from him, nodding with quiet encouragement, as if every answer deserved respect. His calmness radiated in a way Steve couldn't explain. Steve's chest tightened slightly. He wasn't nervous he'd stood in front of millions, but there was a weight pressing on him now, as though the room itself had slowed its heartbeat. He tried to shake it off, tried to crack another line, but the moment felt different. The audience wasn't cold. They weren't distant. They were attentive. Too attentive. Their eyes were watching, waiting, sensing something more than entertainment was about to unfold. For Steve Harvey, a man who lived and breathed by the pulse of laughter, this was a first. And though he didn't fully understand it, he couldn't deny it. The room wasn't his anymore. The game rolled forward, questions flying, answers shouted, and the familiar rhythm of Family Feud filling the air. On the surface, everything looked the same. Contestants laughed nervously. The scoreboard lit up, and Steve Harvey carried his usual swagger. But beneath it all, something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Steve asked another question, pausing for effect the way he always did. He raised an eyebrow, cracked a grin, and leaned into the microphone. Normally, this was the moment the crowd burst into laughter. Tonight, the laughter came, but it didn't carry the same spark. It was softer, shorter, as if the room's energy had been redirected. His eyes flicked to Keanu again. The actor hadn't done anything unusual. He hadn't cracked a joke, hadn't played for the cameras. He simply stood there, posture relaxed, eyes gentle, waiting for his turn. Yet the audience's attention kept drifting toward him. Even the contestants beside him seemed calmer, less jittery, as if his stillness had settled their nerves. Steve's mind churned. He was supposed to be the anchor, the pulse of the show. But for the first time, he felt like a guest in his own house. The crowd wasn't pulling away. They were leaning in, but not toward him. They were leaning towards something Keanu carried without even trying. He asked the next contestant a question and delivered a quick line afterward. The timing was right, the delivery sharp. But again, the room responded differently. It wasn't indifference, it was focus. Like they were saving their energy, waiting for something else, something deeper. Steve swallowed, his grin faltering just for a heartbeat before he covered it. He knew live television demanded momentum, demanded flow. But the more he tried to push, the more it felt like the energy resisted, redirecting back to the quiet man who had said almost nothing since stepping on stage. It wasn't threatening, not in the way another celebrity might try to steal the spotlight. No, this was different. Keanu wasn't competing for attention. He wasn't asking for it at all. But his humility, his calm, his steady presence, it was pulling the room into orbit around him. Steve rubbed his hand over his cue card, the paper crinkling slightly under his palm. He tried to shake it off, to convince himself this was just an off night. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't off. This was intentional. Not by him, not by the producers, but by something greater that had slipped into the cracks of the show and changed the atmosphere completely. As the round ended and applause filled the studio, Steve's heart pounded harder than it should have. He looked out at the audience, then back at Keanu Reeves, and a thought struck him with a chill that ran down his spine. Something is happening here, and I don't know if I'm ready for it. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the red off-air signal flickered above the cameras. The booming applause softened, replaced by the murmurs of the audience stretching their legs, sipping water, and leaning across aisles to chat. Crew members darted onto the stage, checking microphones, fixing hair, and reapplying powder to foreheads shining under the heat of the lamps. Steve Harvey loosened his tie just a fraction, letting out a breath. This was the rhythm of live television. Bursts of performance broken by small pockets of stillness. Normally, Steve used these breaks to recharge his energy, joke with contestants, or chat with the audience in the front rows. But tonight felt different. The first half of the show had been strange, filled with an energy he couldn't quite control, an atmosphere that seemed to bend around the presence of Keanu Reeves. Steve glanced down the row of podiums. The contestants were chatting among themselves, laughing, adjusting their clothes, but Keanu stood slightly apart, his hands resting on the edge of his podium, his posture relaxed. He wasn't scrolling through a phone like the younger actors. He wasn't cracking jokes like the country singers. He was simply present, quietly observing, as though the silence of the break was its own kind of stage. Steve rubbed his chin, curiosity pressing harder with each second. Finally, he stepped across the stage and leaned casually toward Keanu. He kept his voice low, just between the two of them.
You nervous at all about doing live TV like this?
Steve asked, raising an eyebrow. Big crowd, lights, all eyes on you, it rattles some folks, even the veterans. Keanu turned his head, his eyes calm, his smile faint. He shook his head gently. Crowds don't scare me, he said softly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The only thing I fear is losing my soul. The words landed with a thud in Steve's chest. He blinked, caught completely off guard. He had expected a joke, maybe a cool remark about being used to cameras after years of Hollywood premieres. But this was something else entirely. Steve straightened slowly, his usual witty comeback stuck somewhere in his throat. He searched Keanu's face for a hint of irony, a sign that maybe it was just another line. But Keanu's eyes didn't flinch. They carried sincerity, a depth that unsettled Steve more than he wanted to admit. For a man who had heard it all, contestants, celebrities, fans, Steve Harvey found himself unable to reply. The simplicity of the words gnawed at him, echoing louder in the silence of his own thoughts. He laughed awkwardly, trying to mask the way his chest tightened. But even as he smiled, the weight of the answer lingered. For the first time in years, Steve Harvey felt shaken on his own stage. Steve stood there for a beat too long, staring at Keanu as though the man had just pulled back a curtain no one else could see. Around them, the usual bustle of a television break continued without missing a step. Makeup artists hurried from one podium to another, patting down foreheads with powder. Assistants whispered instructions into contestants' ears. A stagehand swept by, carrying a tray of water bottles. But for Steve, all of it blurred into background noise. Losing my soul. The phrase looped in his head, louder each time it repeated. It was the kind of thing a preacher might say from a pulpit, not something you expected from a Hollywood actor standing on a game show set. Steve rubbed his chin, his hand lingering there as he studied Keanu with growing unease, not of distrust, but of recognition. He tried to shake it off. He clapped his hands once, forcing a laugh, and said, "Man, you don't play, do you? Straight to the heavy stuff." He wanted it to sound like a joke, but even to his own ears it rang hollow. The truth was, he couldn't dismiss it. The words had already taken root. Keanu didn't push, he didn't elaborate, or turn the moment into a sermon. He just gave a small nod, almost as if he understood Steve's discomfort, and let the silence rest where it was. That unsettled Steve even more. Most people rushed to fill silence. Keanu seemed to honor it. Steve turned toward the audience briefly. A few fans in the front row were watching the exchange closely, their smiles fading into thoughtful expressions. Even they seemed to feel that something unusual was happening, something deeper than jokes and applause. He drew in a slow breath, tugging lightly at his tie. The break would be over in less than a minute. He knew he had to snap back into the role, the host, the entertainer, the man who kept the train running. But his chest still carried the weight of that sentence. It wasn't fear of the crowd, Keanu had said. It wasn't fear of failure or embarrassment or even rejection. It was fear of losing the very core of who he was. Steve realized how rarely he had thought of it that way. He lived in the spotlight, day after day, but how often did he stop to ask what the spotlight was costing him? The thought made his palms damp. He glanced back at Keanu, who was now quietly greeting the contestant beside him with a soft smile, as if the entire exchange with Steve hadn't even shaken him. The peace on Keanu's face was steady, unshaken. Steve, however, couldn't say the same. The floor manager called out, "Back in 10 seconds." Crew members scurried off the stage, tucking away brushes and clipboards. The red light above the camera began to flash, warning everyone that the show was about to return. Contestants straightened their jackets, smoothed their dresses, and prepared to smile for the audience again. Steve adjusted his cuffs, trying to shake off the heaviness in his chest. He forced a smile, but it didn't come as easily as it usually did. The words clung to him like a weight he couldn't put down. "Crowds don't scare me. The only thing I fear is losing my soul." He rolled the phrase over in his mind again and again, but no matter how many times he tried to treat it like just another comment, it stayed sharp, cutting deeper with each repeat. 5, 4, 3. The director counted down. The applause light blinked on, and the audience erupted once again. The studio roared with cheers, but Steve heard it differently this time. The sound didn't feel like adrenaline. It felt like noise, and noise wasn't enough to drown the echo of Keanu's words. "Welcome back to Family Feud," Steve said, his voice booming as always. He carried the same rhythm, the same gestures, but inside he knew something had shifted. His mind wasn't fully on the cards in his hand, or the scoreboard flashing behind him. It was still caught in that brief moment off-air when the cameras weren't rolling, when Keanu Reeves had dropped a sentence that stripped away the glitter of the stage. Steve asked the next question, and the contestants jumped in with quick answers. The crowd laughed at a few of them, clapping and shouting encouragement. Steve smiled and played along, but his timing felt half a step behind. For the first time in years, he wasn't leading the room, he was following it. Each time he glanced at Keanu, the man was the same, calm, steady, quietly encouraging his teammates with nods and soft words. He didn't compete for attention, but the audience's eyes kept returning to him anyway. Steve swallowed hard. He had been on countless stages. He had commanded arenas, interviewed legends, made millions laugh. But now, standing in the middle of the show he had mastered, he felt shaken. Not by a mistake, not by nerves, but by the quiet presence of a man who had reminded him, in 10 words, of something he hadn't thought about in a long time. For the first time in his career, Steve Harvey felt smaller than the moment unfolding around him. And though the cameras were back on, though the game pressed forward, though laughter still rolled through the crowd, he couldn't escape the truth that lingered in his chest. Something greater than entertainment had stepped onto the stage. The game marched on, but Steve's attention kept drifting. The applause, the laughter, the flashing scoreboard. It all felt thinner now, less solid, as if something more important was tugging at the edges of the set. Every time the cameras cut to a break, Steve's eyes found Keanu without him even trying. The other celebrities used the downtime like clockwork. Phones came out. Selfies were snapped and posted instantly to social media. Assistants whispered updates about texts or schedules. Contestants leaned against podiums, laughing too loudly as they relived a funny moment that had just played out on stage. But Keanu was different. He wasn't scrolling, he wasn't talking, he wasn't even fidgeting. He stood or sat quietly, hands resting loosely in his lap, his posture calm and centered. At first, Steve thought Keanu must be tired. A long day of filming could wear anyone out. But the more he watched, the more he realized it wasn't fatigue. It was focus. Keanu's stillness didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate. His breathing was steady, his gaze soft but alert. He wasn't disconnected from the room. If anything, it felt like he was more present than anyone else. The curiosity grew inside Steve like a restless itch. During one break, he finally gave in. He walked across the stage, his shoes tapping softly against the polished floor, and stopped beside Keanu. The audience chatter hummed in the background, but Steve lowered his voice, as though the conversation deserved its own space. "What is it about you, man?" Steve asked, shaking his head slightly. His usual grin softened into something more serious. "You carry something different. I can feel it. Everyone can feel it. What is it?" Keanu looked up slowly. His dark eyes were kind, not surprised by the question. A gentle smile touched his lips as if he had been expecting it all along. "I've been in loud places my whole life," Keanu said quietly. His words came measured, not rushed. Film sets, red carpets, interviews, premieres. The noise never stops. But I learned something along the way. God speaks loudest in the quiet. The sentence dropped between them, like a stone into water, sending ripples Steve could almost feel. He stared at Keanu, his mouth parting slightly, but no words came out. He tried to cover the pause with a chuckle, though it sounded thinner than usual. "That's deep," he murmured, glancing down at his shoes, then back up at the man beside him. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't just deep, it was piercing. For the first time in his long career, Steve Harvey, the man who always had something to say, found himself almost forgetting he was hosting a show. The producer's voice echoed faintly from the control booth, reminding everyone how much time remained before the cameras rolled again. Contestants straightened their ties, someone sipped nervously from a plastic cup, and the hum of conversation filled the air. But for Steve, all of it felt distant, like he was listening through a wall. His focus stayed locked on Keanu's words. "God speaks loudest in the quiet." The line echoed in his chest, gnawing at the parts of him he rarely exposed. He had built his life around laughter, timing, noise. His stage presence was a force, a rolling tide that kept audiences on their feet. But the idea that something holy might be waiting in silence, that unsettled him. It pressed against questions he hadn't dared to ask himself in years. Steve shifted his weight, folding his arms across his chest. He wanted to shrug it off, crack a joke, return to the rhythm that had carried him through thousands of shows. But he couldn't. Every time he glanced at Keanu, he saw the same calm, steady presence. There was no fidgeting, no nervous smile, no restless chatter. Just quiet. And somehow, that quiet was louder than anything else in the room. "Man," Steve said finally, his voice lower than before, "I've been doing this show for years. Every day, I come out here to get people laughing, lift the energy, keep it moving. That's my job. That's what I do. But since you walked in, I swear it feels like something shifted. It's like you brought the opposite of noise, but it's stronger than the crowd." Keanu didn't interrupt. He just listened, eyes warm, expression soft. That alone made Steve pause again. Most people jumped in, eager to respond, but Keanu gave space, as if silence itself was part of the conversation. Steve exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I don't know why it's hitting me so hard. Maybe it's because I don't stop long enough to think. I'm always moving, always working. But you, man, you stand there like you got nothing to prove." Keanu's faint smile deepened, though he said nothing. And somehow, that was enough to make Steve's chest tighten further. The floor manager raised a hand, signaling 2 minutes until cameras went live again. But Steve barely noticed. For the first time in years, the thought of stepping back into his routine didn't excite him. It felt hollow, even fragile. Something about Keanu's stillness made him realize how much noise he had filled his own life, with noise that left little room for the quiet where God might be waiting. The countdown lights flashed again. 30 seconds, a voice called from the control booth. Crew members moved with speed, their hands adjusting cameras and microphones. Contestants laughed nervously, readying themselves for the next round. The crowd stirred with anticipation, waiting for Steve's booming voice to reignite the room. But Steve wasn't ready. His mind was still tethered to Keanu's words, unwilling to let them go. He turned slightly toward the actor, lowering his voice so no one else would hear. "You're telling me all this noise, this spotlight, the clapping, the jokes, it's not where strength comes from? You really believe God's voice comes through the quiet?" Keanu's gaze lifted slowly, his expression gentle, almost fatherly. "I don't just believe it," he said. "I've lived it. The loudest rooms in my life taught me very little. But the quiet, that's where I found the truth I couldn't ignore. That's where God met me." Steve's breath caught. For a moment, the weight of the words pressed down so heavily he forgot about the cameras, the timing, the audience waiting. He felt like a student sitting at the feet of a teacher, humbled by the clarity in Keanu's tone. The man wasn't performing. He wasn't promoting a movie or trying to sound profound. He was just telling the truth as he had lived it, and that truth carried a power Steve hadn't felt on his own stage in years. The floor manager motioned urgently now. 10 seconds. The audience clapped in rhythm, waiting for Steve to turn his showman switch back on. Steve rubbed the back of his neck, his mind racing. For the first time in his career, he felt reluctant to step back into the spotlight. His heart was too heavy, too stirred, too raw. He realized in that moment he had been given a glimpse of something rare. Keanu's calm presence wasn't just peace, it was conviction, born from walking through fire and coming out with something eternal. Steve felt himself leaning toward that quiet, craving more of it. 5, 4, 3. The countdown continued. Steve inhaled, straightened his jacket, and forced himself back into position. But even as he raised his head to face the cameras, one thought clung stubbornly to his soul. Keanu Reeves carried something the crowd couldn't explain. And Steve Harvey, the man who prided himself on commanding the stage, was realizing he might not be the loudest voice in the room anymore. The game show was about to continue, but deep inside, Steve knew the real show, the one that mattered, had already begun. The cameras rolled once more, but Steve's mind wasn't fully on the game. He asked the next survey question, listened to the contestants' answers, even cracked a joke or two. The audience laughed in all the right places, but his energy wasn't the same. His eyes kept sliding back toward Keanu. Something in him couldn't let the moment go. Finally, during a lull in the action, Steve leaned toward him, lowering his voice, but keeping his gaze steady. "Were you always like this?" he asked. His tone wasn't playful. It wasn't the usual banter of a host filling time between questions. It was raw, genuine curiosity, heavy with a hint of desperation. Keanu didn't answer right away. His eyes softened, his lips pressing together, as though he were weighing whether or not to open a door that had been closed for years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the gravity of someone who wasn't reciting a line, but reliving something real. "No," Keanu said quietly. "I wasn't always like this. Steve leaned in closer, his eyebrows raised. The contestants glanced at each other, sensing that something deeper was unfolding, even as the cameras continued to roll. The audience grew quieter, the laughter thinning out. Keanu continued, his tone low but firm. I've lost people I loved more than I can put into words. I've stood on stages, walked red carpets, heard the applause of thousands, and still felt completely empty inside. I know what it's like to succeed in the eyes of the world and fail in the silence of your own heart. The words hit Steve harder than he expected. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Keanu went on, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the cameras, as if looking back at moments only he could see. There was a time when fame almost swallowed me whole. The pressure, the expectations, the noise, it can burn you out. People think applause fills you, but when it fades, you realize how hollow it really is. I chased it, but it never satisfied me. Not once. Steve swallowed hard, shifting his weight against the podium. His smile had disappeared. The audience leaned in, their attention no longer on the scoreboard, but on the man speaking with such quiet intensity. Keanu's voice softened, almost breaking. It wasn't until I surrendered, until I stopped pretending I could hold everything together, that I found real strength. Not in myself, not in the applause, not in the fame. I found it in God. He carried me when I couldn't take another step. Steve blinked rapidly, his eyes glistening under the bright lights. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Keanu's confession had pierced him too deeply. Keanu paused, his gaze sweeping the studio softly, as if acknowledging the weight of what he had just revealed. His voice, though calm, carried an honesty that made the whole space feel smaller, more intimate, as though everyone present had been pulled into a circle they hadn't expected. When I say I surrendered, Keanu continued, I don't mean I gave up. I mean I stopped carrying what I was never meant to carry alone. Fame, grief, guilt, they were crushing me. I couldn't breathe under it all. But when I dropped to my knees and said, God, I can't do this by myself, that's when something changed. The words lingered. Steve shifted slightly at his podium, his fingers tapping against the card in his hand, though he wasn't reading from it anymore. He looked at Keanu like a man listening for a truth he had almost forgotten existed. Keanu drew in a breath, his eyes lowering for a moment. I start every day on my knees now. Not because I'm weak, not because I'm lost, but because that's where strength begins. It reminds me that no matter how much the world applauds or criticizes, I don't stand on my own. I stand because he holds me up. The crowd hushed. The laughter that had filled the studio only minutes before was gone, replaced by silence so thick it felt like reverence. Even the stagehands, usually busy with cues and props, had stilled. Everyone seemed suspended in the gravity of his words. Steve's jaw flexed, his lips parting, but he didn't speak. His eyes glistened under the lights, catching the shine in a way the cameras couldn't hide. For a man who had mastered the art of speaking quickly, of spinning any moment into humor, he now found himself without a script, without a mask. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Man, Steve whispered, though the microphone still caught it. That right there, that hit me. Keanu looked at him, not with triumph, not with the pride of someone who had silenced a host, but with compassion. It's not about me, he said gently. It's about grace. Every morning I bow, and every morning I rise with the strength I didn't have the night before. That's how I keep going. Steve lowered his head slightly, his hand pressing against the podium as if he needed the support. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just a host. He was a man confronted by truth, raw and undeniable, in front of a nation watching. Steve tried to steady himself, but the lump in his throat refused to dissolve. He gripped his cue card a little tighter, the edges bending under the pressure of his hand. He wasn't thinking about survey answers or the next round of the game. He was thinking about the man beside him, who spoke about kneeling every morning like it was the only way to survive the weight of the world. The cameras continued to roll, catching every flicker of Steve's expression. He was a man known for quick wit, for keeping audiences laughing even in awkward moments. But now he was quiet. his face raw and unguarded. Keanu's voice broke the silence again. Not hurried, not forced. I used to think strength meant standing taller than everyone else, proving myself, fighting every battle, with my fists clenched. But real strength is different. Real strength comes when you let go of pride, when you admit you can't do it all. That's where God steps in. The crowd was no longer restless. They weren't waiting for punchlines or clapping on cue. They were listening, leaning in, their eyes following every word. Even the control room fell still, the director hesitating to cut to commercial. Something bigger than ratings was unfolding. Steve swallowed, his voice thick when he finally spoke. "You're telling me, every morning, you kneel first? Before all the Hollywood chaos? Before the lights and the cameras?" "Yes," Keanu answered simply. "Because that's where I remember who I am. Not an actor, not a name on a marquee, just a man loved by God. That's enough for me." Steve's eyes welled. He blinked quickly, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. He had been in this industry long enough to know masks, to know polish and performance. But Keanu's words were stripped of all of that. They weren't lines, they were lifelines. He let out a trembling laugh, shaking his head. "Man, I don't even know what to say. I've been on this stage for years, but I've never felt it like this." Keanu gave a small, understanding smile. "That's because it's not about the stage. It's about the soul." The studio fell into complete silence for a heartbeat. Then someone in the audience dabbed their eyes with a tissue. Another nodded slowly, as if agreeing with something they had never been able to put into words. The atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was testimony. And standing at the center of it, Steve Harvey struggled to hold himself together. The cameras were still rolling, but something had undeniably changed. The show went on. The rules stayed the same. The questions kept coming, yet the air in the room felt altered. The atmosphere had shifted from entertainment to something closer to reverence. When Steve asked the next survey question, his booming cadence was gone. His voice was still steady, but softer, gentler, carrying less of the showman and more of the man. He read the card as usual, but even his pauses lingered longer, as though the words themselves deserved space to breathe. The contestants answered, some with humor, others with quick wit, but the audience's reaction was different. The laughter that once bounced off the walls now came more quietly, tinged with thoughtfulness. The applause was present, but it sounded softer, slower, almost careful. It wasn't the forced clapping of a studio audience told when to cheer. It was more like the measured response of people who knew they were part of something delicate, something fragile they didn't want to disturb. Keanu's presence had woven itself into the rhythm of the show. Every time he spoke, whether answering a question or making a casual remark, the room stilled. People leaned forward. Even the camera operators, trained to focus on their marks and cues, found themselves listening more than working. Keanu wasn't delivering speeches. He wasn't performing. But his words carried a weight that made people hear them differently. One question came across the board, something playful about things you might forget when leaving the house. Contestants shouted the obvious answers: keys, wallet, phone. Laughter rippled when one team member blurted something silly. Steve smiled and teased them, but when Keanu's turn came, the room hushed. He pressed the buzzer gently, his eyes thoughtful. "I think the one thing we forget most often," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "is gratitude." The audience stilled. It wasn't a typical Family Feud answer. It wasn't even on the board, but no one cared. A murmur spread across the room, soft and reverent, like the acknowledgement of a truth too often overlooked. Steve tilted his head, studying him, his lips parting as though he wanted to say something, but nothing came. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, almost self-conscious, and shook his head. "Man, you just turned Family Feud into Sunday morning," he said, but even his humor carried no mockery, just respect. The audience chuckled lightly, but the mood remained different. It wasn't raucous laughter, it was knowing. People in the crowd exchanged looks, nodding quietly to themselves, as though they'd just been reminded of something they too had forgotten. As the game continued, the contrast grew clearer. Every contestant still played, every answer still mattered, but the energy had slowed into something more reflective. Steve's jokes no longer flew in quick succession. Instead, he let silences linger, let answers breathe. He even caught himself nodding more than laughing, as though he too was absorbing something from the presence beside him. For years, Family Feud had been a stage of competition, energy, and laughter. But tonight, under the glow of the lights and with the cameras capturing every angle, the set began to feel different. It felt less like a studio and more like a sanctuary, a place where words pierced deeper than jokes and silences spoke louder than applause. As the next round began, Steve glanced at the scoreboard but hardly cared about the numbers. His eyes drifted back toward Keanu. He felt something happening in the room that went beyond tallying points. It was like the very air carried a charge, something that made every person more aware, more awake than they had been when the show started. Another contestant buzzed in with an answer, and the crowd gave a polite laugh. Normally, Steve would jump in, build on it, push the moment bigger, but tonight, he simply smiled and let the laughter fade on its own. His instincts, sharpened by decades on stage, told him not to fight the shift, but to follow it. The camera cut briefly to Keanu again. He stood with the same quiet posture, calm but not detached. When the focus returned to him, Steve found himself asking the next question in a lower tone, almost conversational. Keanu's eyes softened, and he hesitated for a moment before answering. "Patience," he said simply. It wasn't on the board either, but the studio reacted the same way it had earlier, with silence, followed by nods, as if the answer reached beyond the game into something universal. Even those who had come expecting only laughter and entertainment now leaned forward, caught in a moment they hadn't anticipated. Steve felt the shift inside himself too. He wasn't just hosting anymore. He was listening, learning, maybe even being led. The show was still happening. Cameras were rolling, lights were blazing, but something more powerful was unfolding beneath the surface. For years, Steve had stood on this stage, feeding energy into the room, pushing humor, guiding the rhythm. Tonight, the rhythm was different, and for once, he wasn't leading. He was part of it. His voice softened without him meaning to. His jokes came fewer and slower, and each time Keanu spoke, Steve felt his own heart stirred in ways he couldn't explain. The audience noticed too. The clapping between rounds no longer erupted with the same force. It came more gently, reverently, like the applause you might hear in a place of worship rather than a game show. There were smiles in the crowd, but also tears glinting in the lights. Some people folded their hands unconsciously. Others bowed their heads, as if they were in prayer, even though no one had asked them to. Steve felt his throat tighten. For years, he had prayed quietly before shows, asking God to use him to bring joy. But never in his wildest imagination had he thought the stage would turn into something like this, something so sacred it almost frightened him. He stole another glance at Keanu. The man wasn't trying to change the atmosphere. He wasn't even aware of the effect he was having. He was simply being himself, carrying the stillness that came from his faith. And that alone had transformed the Family Feud set into something more than entertainment. For the first time in the show's history, Steve realized the cameras weren't capturing just a competition, they were capturing a moment of grace. The game pressed on, but Steve couldn't hold back any longer. He had asked Keanu casual questions during breaks, and each time the man's answers had disarmed him. Now, with the cameras rolling and the audience leaning forward in anticipation, Steve felt compelled to ask something deeper. He gripped his card but didn't glance at it. Instead, he turned toward Keanu, his voice quieter than usual. "Keanu, I want to ask you something different," he said, his tone stripped of its usual playfulness. "What's the hardest part of living your faith in Hollywood?" The question landed heavy in the room. Contestants shifted uncomfortably, and the audience fell still. Even the crew stopped moving, sensing something significant was about to unfold. Keanu lowered his gaze for a moment, then lifted a hand to touch the small silver cross that hung around his neck. He pressed it lightly between his fingers, the gesture simple yet intimate, as though drawing strength from its presence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a softness that reached every corner of the studio. "The hardest part isn't the pressure," Keanu said slowly. "It's not the lights, the cameras, the critics, or the expectations. I've faced those my whole life. The hardest part is staying true when no one is watching." The audience leaned closer, the silence pressing in. Keanu's eyes glistened slightly as he continued. "It's easy to stand tall when the crowd is cheering. It's harder when you're alone, when the room is quiet, when temptation whispers that no one will ever know. That's when faith is tested. That's when character is revealed." Steve's throat tightened. He could feel the words cutting past the stage lights and striking somewhere deep in his chest. Keanu took a small breath, his hand still on the cross. "I remind myself that Jesus wasn't a myth. He wasn't a story passed down just to inspire us. He was real. He walked this earth. He felt pain. He walked, cried tears. He loved people who didn't deserve it, and he still does." The last three words seemed to ripple through the room like a shockwave. "And he still does." The audience grew utterly silent. No shifting in their seats, no whispered commentary, just stillness, as if every person present recognized that they weren't merely hearing a celebrity speak, they were hearing a testimony. Steve lowered his head slightly, unable to hide the tears welling in his eyes. He gripped the podium tightly, holding himself steady as Keanu's words lingered in the charged air. "Hollywood is loud," Keanu went on. "It tells you who you should be, what you should want, how you should act. But I don't look to Hollywood to tell me who I am. I look to him because he was real. He is real, and his love hasn't changed." Steve could barely breathe. For a moment, he forgot the cameras, the game, and the audience. He felt as if Keanu wasn't speaking only to the room, but directly to him. The silence stretched on so long that even the control booth hesitated to cut away. The director's hand hovered over the button for a commercial break, but something inside him told him not to touch it. Something holy was happening, and the cameras needed to stay. Keanu lowered his hand from the cross, letting it rest gently against his chest. His eyes swept the room, not as a performer scanning his audience, but as a man sharing his heart with fellow souls. "Jesus loved in ways we can barely understand," he said softly. "He washed feet. He welcomed outcasts. He forgave people who cursed him. That's not a myth. That's history. That's truth. And when I remember that, it changes how I live even when no one else is watching." The audience was completely still. A woman in the third row wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. A man near the aisle lowered his head, lips moving in silent prayer. Even the contestants, once buzzing with nervous energy, stood, motionless, drinking in every word. Steve's hand trembled as he placed his cue card on the podium. He didn't want to hold it anymore. The game, the scoreboard, the bright flashing lights, it all seemed small compared to the words filling the room. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Man, you're saying this right here, live, in front of millions." Keanu nodded gently, his voice steady. "Because truth doesn't change depending on who's watching. Jesus isn't only real in church, he's real in Hollywood. He's real in quiet homes. He's real right here, on this stage." The words broke something open in Steve. His head lowered and his shoulders shook as he tried to hold back the tears threatening to spill. He had always been proud of his ability to keep the show moving, to keep the audience laughing. But tonight, the laughter wasn't what mattered. It was this moment, raw, unfiltered, holy. The crowd seemed to sense his struggle. They grew even quieter, giving space for Steve to gather himself. But the cameras caught every flicker in his expression, every shimmer in his eyes. For once, Steve Harvey wasn't a host. He was simply a man being confronted with truth. Keanu's voice softened further, his tone almost like a prayer. "He still loves us the same way today. That hasn't changed, and it never will." When the applause fades, when the cameras turn off, When the crowd goes home, his love is still there. That's what I hold on to. The moment was electric, though no one moved. The silence was charged, alive. It wasn't emptiness, it was reverence. The family feud set, a place known for laughter and competition, had transformed into something that felt closer to a sanctuary. Steve finally lifted his head, his voice thick with emotion. "Keanu, I've sat across from a lot of people. I've heard stories that made me laugh, made me cry, but I've never felt a moment like this." The audience nodded, many of them with tears on their faces, as if silently agreeing. Keanu simply bowed his head slightly, the faintest smile on his lips. "That's not me," he said quietly. "That's him." The words landed like a final stone dropped in water, sending ripples that would reach far beyond the studio, into homes, into hearts, into lives watching from across the country. And for the first time, everyone knew they weren't just witnessing a show, they were witnessing a testimony. Steve's usual energy had faded almost completely. He wasn't standing tall with booming presence. He wasn't throwing out quick-witted lines to keep the crowd laughing. He stood quieter now, leaning slightly forward, his voice trembling just enough to show the weight of what was stirring in him. The lights above the set still burned bright, but it didn't feel like a game show anymore. It felt like something else, something deeper. He looked directly at Keanu, his eyes searching. "I need to ask you something," he said, his tone stripped of showmanship. "When you're on set, when you're playing those roles that the whole world sees, do you ever feel like Jesus is with you?" The room froze. The audience went still. Contestants lowered their gazes, as though giving the moment room to breathe. Even the crew members behind the cameras, usually locked into their technical tasks, found themselves staring in silence, waiting for the answer. Keanu didn't rush. He drew in a slow breath, his eyes lowering for a moment before lifting again, shimmering slightly under the lights. His lips parted, but he paused, as though he needed to steady himself before letting the words out. "Yes," Keanu said softly. His voice carried no hesitation, only truth. "Sometimes when a scene calls for kindness or sacrifice, I feel him beside me. Not as a role, not as a script, as a presence." The words pressed into the silence like a revelation. His tone wasn't loud, yet it resonated across every heart in the room. Crew members shifted in their spots, some blinking hard, others discreetly wiping at their eyes. The audience, who had come expecting laughter and competition, now found themselves holding back tears. Steve's hand tightened on the podium. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. He had asked the question half in hope, half in desperation, unsure of what he would hear. But Keanu's answer struck deeper than anything he had expected. Keanu's eyes glistened as he continued. "There are moments on set where the lines blur. I'm speaking words written by someone else, but my heart feels something greater moving through me. When I look into another actor's eyes in a moment of compassion or forgiveness, sometimes it's not acting anymore. It's real. I feel him there, reminding me it's not just a story. It's his story." A hush swept across the studio. No one moved, no one coughed or whispered. The cameras kept rolling, but even they seemed secondary to what was unfolding. Steve pressed his lips together, trying to keep his composure, but his eyes betrayed him, glistening with tears that refused to stay hidden. He leaned in a little closer, his voice trembling. "Man, that's something I've never heard said out loud before." Keanu nodded gently, his voice calm but full of conviction. "That's because it's not something I plan or force. It just happens. And when it does, I know it's not me performing. It's him reminding me that his love can shine anywhere, even in the middle of Hollywood." Steve stood frozen, his hand gripping the edge of the podium like it was the only thing holding him steady. His face, usually animated with wide smiles and booming laughter, was softened now, vulnerable, unguarded. His voice dropped lower, his tone stripped bare of every layer of performance. "You really feel him in those moments?" he asked again, his words heavy, almost like a whisper. Keanu nodded slowly. His eyes glistened, and his hand, once again brushed the cross, resting against his chest. "Yes," he said firmly. "I feel him when I'm asked to show love, when I have to choose forgiveness in a scene. When I carry someone else's pain, even if it's only for a moment of film, I feel him reminding me that this is who he is, that he's never far." The weight of his confession pressed into the hearts of everyone present. A camera operator lowered his lens slightly, blinking hard as tears blurred his vision. A makeup artist standing off to the side lifted her hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming. Even the contestants, who had walked onto the stage prepared for laughter and competition, now stood still, some nodding, others dabbing at their eyes. Steve exhaled shakily. He had been in entertainment long enough to see every kind of performance, every kind of persona. But this wasn't acting. This wasn't a crafted soundbite for television. This was raw, unfiltered truth, spoken with a sincerity that shook him to the core. "I'll be honest," Steve said, his voice cracking as he tried to hold steady. "I've prayed before shows. I've asked God to use me, to let me make somebody smile who might need it. But I don't think I've ever had the courage to say out loud what you just said. Not on live TV. Not like this." Keanu gave him a gentle look, one filled with compassion rather than judgment. "That's the beauty of his presence, Steve," he said quietly. "It's not bound by place or stage. It doesn't matter if it's a church or a movie set, a game show or a quiet room at home. He meets us wherever we are. Even here." The audience stirred again, but not with laughter or applause. Many bowed their heads. Some held their hands together. Others simply sat in silence, their faces streaked with tears. The Family Feud studio had been transformed into something far beyond entertainment. It felt like holy ground. Steve wiped his face with the back of his hand, unashamed of the tears that slipped free. "Man, I don't even know how to move on from that," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "This ain't just a show anymore. I feel like I'm standing in something bigger than all of us." Keanu's faint smile carried peace. "That's because you are," he said softly. The silence that followed was charged, alive with something deeper than words. For the first time in the history of the show, no one in the room wanted the cameras to cut away. They knew they were witnessing something they would never forget. The tension in the studio had reached a level no one expected. The cameras still rolled, but the game show format had all but dissolved into something unplanned. The lights felt softer somehow, the air heavier with meaning. Steve Harvey gripped the podium with both hands, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. He had listened to Keanu speak about faith, about Jesus walking and loving and still being present, and something inside him cracked wide open. He let out a breath he had been holding far too long. His voice trembled as he spoke, no longer trying to mask what he felt. "Man," Steve said, his eyes fixed on Keanu, "hearing you talk like this, it makes me want to be a better Christian." The words hit the studio like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed from the crowd. Audience members glanced at each other, wide-eyed, stunned by the rawness of his confession. Steve Harvey was a man known for jokes, for bravado, for energy, but rarely had he laid himself bare like this, especially not on live television. His voice cracked further as he went on. "I've been in church, I've prayed, but I don't always live it the way I should. I get caught up in this world, in the spotlight, in the noise. But hearing you, Keanu, hearing you, makes me remember what I've been missing." Keanu didn't rush to respond. He let the words breathe, let the vulnerability hang in the air with the respect it deserved. Finally, he leaned slightly forward, his face soft, his tone gentle but firm. "That's what Jesus does," he said. "He doesn't ask for perfection, he asks for love." The room fell into a hush, so thick it felt sacred. Audience members' faces crumpled as tears rolled freely. Some lowered their heads, hands clasped together. Others simply wept openly, their hearts breaking at the simplicity and depth of Keanu's response. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, fighting against the tears threatening to overtake him. His hand pressed against his chest as, though steadying a heart suddenly too heavy with conviction, he whispered, barely loud enough for the microphone to catch, "Man, that's the realest thing I've ever heard on this stage." Keanu nodded gently. It's the truth. We try so hard to be perfect, to impress, to hold it all together. But Jesus never asked for that. He asked us to love God and love people. That's it. The rest, He carries. The audience reacted with sniffles, nods, even quiet amens whispered through trembling lips. The camera panned slowly across the crowd, catching tear-streaked faces and bowed heads. It was no longer entertainment. It was something far more profound. The producer in the control booth hovered nervously, unsure of what to do. His training told him to cut to commercial to regain control of the program, but his heart told him to let it flow. Something real, something beyond television, was happening before his eyes, and he knew instinctively that interrupting it would be wrong. Steve wiped his face with his hand, no longer caring about appearances. He looked at Keanu with eyes full of gratitude and longing. "Man, you don't know what you've just stirred up in me." Keanu placed a hand over his chest, his voice steady and kind. "It's not me, Steve. It's him. And he's stirring because he loves you too much to let you forget." The words landed with force. Steve's knees wobbled, his body visibly shaking as he tried to contain the flood of emotions welling up inside. Steve's shoulders began to shake as he tried to keep his composure, but the weight of the moment overpowered him. He lowered his head, his lips trembling as he fought the tears. But they came anyway, rolling down his face under the bright studio lights. The audience, watching a man known for strength and humor bare his heart on live television, gasped again. It was as though they too had reached their breaking point alongside him. He finally lifted his head, his voice hoarse. "You're right," he said, looking at Keanu with eyes red from weeping. "It ain't about being perfect. I've spent too much of my life trying to be good enough, trying to look like I've got it together. But what you're saying, it's reminding me that maybe God's love is bigger than my failures." Keanu leaned closer, his expression calm, his words carrying the weight of reassurance. "It is, Steve. That's the whole point. None of us are enough on our own. That's why grace exists. That's why love covers what we can't fix ourselves." The audience reacted audibly now, many breaking into sobs. A woman in the front row lifted her hands in silent worship. A man behind her bowed his head, his lips moving in prayer. Even members of the crew, professionals trained to remain stoic during filming, wiped at their eyes. The show had lost its structure, but gained something far more powerful, an authenticity that no script could ever create. Steve pressed a hand to his chest, his breathing uneven. "I feel it," he admitted openly. "Right here. I feel like God is in this room. I feel like He's been waiting on me to stop performing and just be honest." The crowd murmured in agreement, soft cries echoing like an amen across the studio. The producer in the control room dropped his headset into his lap, unable to call a cut. He knew he was witnessing history, something raw and divine flowing through what had once been a game show taping. Keanu's voice lowered, steady and compassionate. "That's him, Steve. That stirring, that weight you feel. It's His love, and it doesn't stop when the cameras go off. It follows you. It stays with you." Steve shook his head slowly, his tears now falling freely. "Man, I never thought Family Feud would turn into this. But I know I don't ever want to forget what I'm feeling right now." The audience rose to their feet, not in applause, but in reverent silence. Some hugged each other, others simply stood with tears streaming down their faces. What was once entertainment had become something that felt closer to revival. And at the center of it all stood Keanu Reeves, humble and calm, pointing not to himself, but to the one he had been speaking about all along. The silence following Steve's confession hung heavy in the studio. The crowd was on their feet, some crying openly, others bowing their heads as though reverence itself had taken hold of the room. Steve's chest rose and fell sharply, his hand gripping the podium. But then, suddenly, he let go. His voice rang out across the set, unplanned, raw, and trembling with conviction. "I think we need to pray right now," Steve blurted, his words echoing like a plea more than a command. The audience gasped softly, followed by a wave of quiet cheers and amens. Heads bowed instantly, as though everyone had been waiting for permission. Crew members, usually hidden behind cameras and lighting rigs, lowered their heads too. Even the contestants, once ready to play for points, now stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes wet, their faces transformed by the moment. Keanu moved gently towards Steve, his presence calm and steady. He reached out, taking Steve's hands into his own. The gesture was simple, but the symbolism was powerful. Two men, one known for his comedy and the other for his films, standing together in humility, united in faith before millions of viewers. The audience quieted even more, the entire room folding into an expectant silence. It wasn't a silence of emptiness, it was the quiet of anticipation, as though every heart leaned forward, waiting for what would come next. Keanu bowed his head, his voice breaking the stillness in soft prayer. Thank you, Lord, for showing up in unexpected places. Thank you for reminding us that you are not bound to walls or buildings, but that you meet us wherever we are, even here, in this studio, on this stage, in front of cameras. His words carried no theatrics, no grandeur. They were humble, spoken with the sincerity of a man who knew the weight of grace firsthand. The moment his voice rose into the room, tears began to flow. Audience members clutched each other, heads bowed low. Crew members wiped their eyes with sleeves. Steve squeezed Keanu's hands tighter, tears slipping down his cheeks as he whispered under his breath. Yes, Lord, Keanu continued. We thank you for every heart in this room, for every life touched tonight. We thank you that your love is greater than our mistakes, greater than our fears, greater than the weight we try to carry alone. Tonight, you've reminded us that we are never alone, not for 1 second. The room shifted again. What had started as a show, what had transformed into testimony, was now something even deeper. A prayer circle began to form. Contestants reached for each other's hands. Audience members leaned across aisles to connect. Even camera operators set down their gear, joining in as the circle widened, expanding until it included cast, crew, contestants, and spectators alike. The cameras continued rolling, but the footage no longer resembled a game show. It looked like revival, captured in real time. Steve's voice cracked through his tears. Lord, forgive us when we forget you, he whispered aloud, his words spilling out unfiltered. Forgive me for every time I let this stage or this world make me forget who I belong to. Thank you for sending this brother here to remind me. The audience sobbed softly. Some spoke prayers of their own under their breath. Others raised their hands in surrender. The Family Feud stage, built for laughter and games, had become holy ground. And at the center, Keanu Reeves prayed on, his voice gentle, his spirit humble, his words carrying a weight that reached far beyond the studio walls. Keanu's voice remained calm, steady, and low, but the power of his words rippled through every heart in the room. Father, tonight, you've reminded us that you can use anyone, anywhere, to bring your presence. You've reminded us that it's not about lights or applause or fame. It's about love, pure, unconditional love that meets us in our brokenness and makes us whole again. His words sank deep. Audience members openly sobbed, shoulders shaking as they clutched one another. A woman in the second row dropped to her knees, hands lifted toward the ceiling. A man standing near the back, who had come only to watch a taping, now wept into his hands, overwhelmed by what he felt. Steve's lips trembled as he joined in, his voice breaking with rawness. Yes, Lord. Thank you for meeting us here. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for giving us this moment to remember what really matters. The circle tightened, hands linked across aisles, strangers embracing strangers. The game show that had brought them together faded into the background, replaced by something eternal. Even the control room, watching through monitors, found themselves bowing their heads. The producer, who had once hesitated to cut away, now let tears fall onto his desk, whispering his own silent prayer. Keanu's words softened, but the depth of them only grew stronger. We ask for peace for every person here, Lord, for strength where there's weakness, for hope where there's despair, for faith where there's fear. Let this moment not end when the cameras stop. Let it carry into every home watching, every heart that feels far from you tonight. Remind them that you are close. The audience answered with a wave of soft amens, voices trembling yet united. Steve squeezed Keanu's hands harder, his eyes closed tight. God, you know me. You know I stumble. You know I fall short. But tonight I want to give you every part of me. I don't care who's watching. I don't care if the whole world sees my tears. I want you to know my heart. The words broke the last of the resistance in the room. People everywhere were crying, not just quietly, but openly. Their voices rising like a chorus of hearts laid bare. Some rocked gently as they prayed. Others whispered Jesus' name through trembling lips. The Family Feud studio had become more than a set. It had become a sanctuary. Keanu closed the prayer simply. Thank you, Lord, for being here with us, for loving us as we are, for never leaving us. Amen. The word amen echoed across the studio like a wave. People repeated it, some shouting, some whispering, some sobbing as they said it. The atmosphere was thick, reverent, alive with something that defied explanation. And as Steve opened his eyes, his cheeks streaked with tears, he knew one thing with certainty. This was no longer his show. This was God's moment. The prayer ended, but the atmosphere did not fade. If anything, it deepened. The silence was not the kind that waits for applause or for a host to move things forward. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, sacred, like the very air itself was charged with something holy. Steve Harvey stood at the podium, his face wet with tears, his body trembling with emotion. He looked out at the crowd, then back at Keanu, his lips quivering before he spoke again. I feel him here right now, he said, his voice raw and broken. I don't know how else to say it. I feel God in this place. The words rolled through the studio like a wave. The audience responded not with cheers, but with sobs, nods, and whispered prayers. A ripple moved across the room as people sank to their knees. Some folded their hands. Others lifted their arms high. But all were united in reverence. Even the skeptics among the staff, those who had worked on hundreds of productions without once considering matters of faith, found themselves shaken. A lighting technician leaned against the wall, his hand covering his mouth as tears filled his eyes. A stagehand, known for his dry humor and sharp tongue, stood motionless, his head bowed as though something far beyond his understanding had humbled him. In the control room, the phones began to light up. At first it was one call, then another, then a flood. Viewers who had been watching the show from their homes were calling in, their voices trembling as they spoke to the staff, answering the lines. I don't know what I'm watching, but I feel it, one caller said. Another wept openly, saying, please tell them to keep going. I feel God in my living room right now. The producer sat frozen in his chair, headset askew, staring at the monitors in disbelief. He had overseen countless tapings, dealt with technical glitches, audience mishaps, and on-air surprises, but nothing like this. What was happening could not be planned, could not be manufactured. It was real. It was alive. It was spreading beyond the walls of the studio into homes across the country. Steve's hands shook as he gripped the podium again. He lowered his head, his body rocking slightly with the weight of his emotions. For a man who had built a career on controlling a room with laughter, he was now undone by something he could not control. He wept openly, his tears unashamed, his voice barely above a whisper as he repeated, I feel him. I feel him here. Keanu stood beside him, silent but steady. His presence calm as though anchoring the room. He didn't need to add anything. He simply let the moment breathe, his hands folded loosely in front of him, his eyes lowered in reverence. The audience continued to weep and pray. Some clutched each other's hands, others rocked gently where they knelt. The air was heavy, yet freeing, overwhelming, yet peaceful. And somewhere in that mixture of tears and trembling breaths, it became clear. This was no longer entertainment. This was no longer Family Feud. This was revival. The energy in the room grew heavier, yet it was not a weight that crushed. It was a weight that lifted burdens, a presence that seemed to press down only to set people free. The audience no longer looked like spectators. They looked like worshipers, caught in a wave too powerful to resist. One by one, more people dropped to their knees. Contestants, dressed for television and ready to compete minutes before, now knelt side by side, their hands clasped tightly as they whispered prayers. Some sobbed into their palms, others simply stared upward, with tears running freely down their cheeks. The game was gone. The scoreboard lights still glowed, but no one paid them any attention. Something eternal had taken its place. Steve Harvey's sobs grew louder, echoing through the microphone. He didn't care that millions might be watching. He no longer tried to hold the image of host, entertainer, or celebrity. His voice broke as he cried out, "Lord, I know you're here. I know it. Forgive me for every time I doubted. Forgive me for letting this world distract me. Tonight, I just want you." The audience responded with a chorus of amens, voices trembling but strong. Some rose to their feet again, hands lifted. Others stayed on their knees, their tears falling onto the studio floor. Keanu closed his eyes, his lips moving in quiet prayer. He didn't command attention. He simply embodied it. His stillness drew others in, his humility amplifying the sacredness of the moment. When he finally lifted his head, his words were soft but clear. He's here for all of us, not just for a show, not just for a stage. He's here because he loves us, every single one. The control room phones were overwhelmed now. Operators answered call after call, their own voices breaking as they relayed the words pouring in from across the nation. "I just turned on the TV to laugh, and now I'm on my knees in my living room," one caller sobbed. Another whispered through tears, "Please don't cut away. I've been far from God for years, but tonight I feel Him pulling me back." The producer pressed his palms into his face, his headset sliding down his neck. He had built a career on professionalism, on sticking to the schedule, on knowing when to cue commercial breaks. But tonight, none of that mattered. He let the cameras roll, tears spilling as he whispered to himself, "I don't understand this, but I can't deny it." The miracle of the moment was not flashy. There were no special effects, no dramatic cues. It was in the stillness, the reverence, the undeniable sense that heaven had touched earth in the middle of a television show. Steve raised his head, his face wet, his voice breaking as he declared again, "This isn't just a show anymore. This is God's moment." And the audience roared, not in entertainment, but in agreement. A wave of voices crying out together as the sacred overtook the stage. The studio was already hushed, the energy heavy with reverence, when Keanu Reeves slowly turned toward Steve Harvey. The bright lights reflected off his calm expression, but his eyes shimmered with something deeper, compassion and conviction, as though he carried a message meant only for this exact moment. Steve, still trembling from the weight of what had unfolded, wiped at his face with the back of his hand, but the tears wouldn't stop. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his heart pounding, as though he already knew something sacred was about to be spoken. Keanu's voice broke the silence, low and steady, each word deliberate. "Steve, can I tell you something?" Steve nodded, unable to speak, his throat too tight to form words. He leaned in, eyes locked on Keanu, desperate for whatever was about to follow. Keanu's words came softly, yet with a weight that shook the air. "Do you know what Jesus would say to you right now?" The audience gasped quietly. Crew members leaned forward. Steve's lips parted, but no sound came out. The atmosphere shifted again, as though the entire room braced for a truth too great to anticipate. Keanu let the moment breathe before continuing. His eyes never left Steve's. He would say, "Steve, my son, I'm proud of you. You've used your gift to bring joy, and today you honored me. The words landed like lightning and balm all at once. Steve's knees nearly buckled. His face crumpled as if every mask he had worn as a performer, as a host, as a man in the spotlight, shattered in an instant. He covered his face with both hands, sobbing openly, unashamed of the tears that poured forth. The audience wept with him. Some cried silently, others out loud. It wasn't sympathy they felt. It was as if Keanu's words, carrying the echo of something divine, reached through Steve and into their own hearts. Steve's voice broke between sobs. "Oh my God, I feel him. I feel him here right now." His words were raw, stripped of polish, no longer a host's performance, but a man's confession. Keanu's expression softened even more. His own eyes glistened, though he stood steady, his presence like an anchor in a storm. For a brief moment, he looked almost fragile, yet radiating an unshakable peace that filled the stage. He stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Steve's shoulder. His voice, barely above a whisper, carried throughout the silent studio. "Steve, you've made millions laugh. You've lifted people when they were hurting, even when you didn't know it. That's God's work too. Tonight, He just wanted you to remember that He sees you, He knows you, and He's proud." Steve sobbed harder, his glasses fogged and useless, his body trembling as if a lifetime of hidden doubts and questions were being answered all at once. His vulnerability broke open the last wall in the room. The crowd erupted into quiet cries and amens. Contestants reached out, holding hands. Crew members wiped their cheeks, some letting equipment hang loose at their sides. The entire studio was undone, transformed into a sanctuary by the sheer weight of truth spoken aloud. Steve finally lowered his hands, his face wet, his voice still trembling. He looked at Keanu through tears and whispered, "I never thought I'd hear words like that. Not here, not like this." Keanu gave a small nod, his own tears now visible. God doesn't wait for perfect places. He shows up where hearts are open. And tonight, He wanted yours. The stillness returned, thick and holy, wrapping itself around every soul present. Steve's body shook as he tried to compose himself, but the tears kept flowing. He wasn't just reacting to emotion, he was experiencing something deeper, something that cut through all the years of laughter, applause, and noise. It was the unmistakable feeling of being seen by God. The cameras continued to roll, but no one behind the lens thought of cutting away. The producer, still wiping his own face, simply whispered into his headset, "Let it play. This is bigger than us." Steve placed a hand on his chest, his breath ragged, his voice fragile as he whispered into the microphone. "All my life, I've been chasing laughs. I thought if I could make people happy, maybe I'd finally feel whole. But hearing that God is proud of me, I don't know if I've ever felt anything like this." The audience wept harder. For so many, his honesty mirrored their own lives. The search for validation, the hunger for love, the fear of never being enough. And yet, through Keanu's words, they were reminded that God's approval wasn't earned in applause, but given in love. Keanu kept his hand on Steve's shoulder, steady and calm. His voice trembled but carried a certainty no one could deny. "Steve, the world knows you as a man who makes them laugh, but God knows you as His son. Tonight He just wanted you to remember that your worth isn't in the spotlight. It's in Him." Steve nodded, his tears still spilling, his voice breaking as he said, "Man, I don't even care that this is live TV. If people see me crying, let them. Because this is real." The audience clapped softly through their tears, affirming his courage. The reverence in the room only deepened. Keanu's own tears slipped free now, but he smiled through them. His presence radiated peace, not from himself, but from something greater flowing through him. "Steve, tonight, you didn't just host a show. You opened a door, and through that door, God stepped in. That's what people will remember. Not the questions, not the points, but this moment when His love broke through." Steve covered his face again, overwhelmed, then dropped his hands and laughed through his tears. "Man, I've never been so undone on stage in my life." Keanu's smile grew gentle, almost fatherly. That's what happens when love shows up. It doesn't shame us. It frees us. The audience applauded again, not with the usual roar of excitement, but with the sound of hearts united in awe. Crew members bowed their heads. Contestants clutched each other's hands. The atmosphere remained charged, sacred, impossible to explain yet undeniable to everyone present. Steve exhaled deeply, his voice hushed but certain. "I'll never forget this night." Keanu nodded, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "None of us will, because tonight wasn't about us. It was about him." The words lingered, echoing through the studio like a benediction. The taping ended hours earlier, but no one who had been in the studio that night could shake what they had witnessed. For days, the energy of that sacred moment lingered. Contestants went home still trembling. Makeup artists confessed they had whispered their first prayers in years, and camera operators told their families that they had seen something on that set no one could explain. But the impact didn't stop there. When the episode aired, the response was instant and overwhelming. Social media platforms lit up within minutes. Viewers who had tuned in, expecting laughs and playful competition, suddenly found themselves weeping in their living rooms. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Phrases like "the miracle episode" and "Steve Harvey and Keanu Reeves" began trending worldwide. Clips of the exchange between Steve and Keanu circulated across every platform. The moment when Steve broke down and Keanu told him Jesus would say he's proud of you was replayed millions of times. In less than 24 hours, the video had racked up tens of millions of views. Within the week, it became one of the most shared television moments in modern history. Churches began using the footage in their sermons. Pastors stood before their congregations, playing the clip on big screens, pausing to remind their people that faith wasn't confined to church walls. If God could show up on a game show stage, he could show up anywhere. The impact rippled through congregations across denominations, uniting Christians in awe and even drawing skeptics to ask questions they hadn't dared voice before. Steve Harvey himself was permanently changed. In the days following the episode, he spoke openly in interviews about what he experienced. His voice cracked as he admitted, "I've been on stage my whole life. I've had people clap, cheer, and laugh at my jokes. But that night, for the first time, I felt like God himself was talking to me, and I'll never be the same." From that moment forward, Steve began starting every taping with a quiet prayer. At first, the network executives were nervous, afraid it might alienate viewers, but instead, ratings climbed. People tuned in not just for entertainment, but for authenticity. Viewers wanted to see a man who wasn't afraid to honor God on national television. And Steve delivered, day after day, grounding his humor in something deeper than laughs. Keanu Reeves was equally overwhelmed by the aftermath. His team had never seen such a flood of messages. Thousands poured in from around the world. Some were from fans who had followed him for decades, others from strangers who had never cared for Hollywood but now found themselves deeply moved by his testimony. Messages came from broken families, grieving parents, recovering addicts, lonely teenagers, each sharing how his words had reminded them that God was real, that love was still alive, and that faith could still change a life. One woman wrote, "I was on the edge of ending my life, and then I saw you tell Steve Harvey that Jesus is proud of him. I broke down. For the first time in years, I prayed. You saved me," another said. "My son hasn't spoken to me in months, but after watching that episode, he called and said he wanted to come home." Keanu read every message he could, tears welling as he realized that something far bigger than himself had taken place. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't scripted it. He had simply spoken from his heart about Jesus, and somehow, those words carried across the world like wildfire. The entertainment industry couldn't ignore what had happened. Articles appeared in major newspapers and magazines with headlines like, "Faith breaks through on primetime television," and "Keanu Reeves and Steve Harvey bring God to the game show stage." Networks scrambled to understand why this episode resonated so deeply. It wasn't scripted drama or manufactured spectacle. It was raw honesty, faith, colliding with reality in a way no producer could have planned. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effect spread even further. Churches across America reported a surge in attendance. Some pastors said people came to services holding their phones, asking if they could play clips from the episode because it had stirred something they didn't know how to put into words. Others testified that entire families who had drifted from faith for years were suddenly returning, drawn by the authenticity of what they had seen. Internationally, the moment reached beyond cultural and language barriers. Subtitled clips went viral in Latin America, Europe, and Asia. In small villages and big cities alike, people gathered around screens to watch Steve Harvey weep and Keanu Reeves speak words of faith that echoed like a prayer. It became more than a television memory, it became a global testimony. Steve himself couldn't shake the change. Every time he stepped on set afterward, he felt different. It wasn't just a stage anymore, it was holy ground. He began speaking to his staff with more kindness, praying before each show, and reminding everyone that what they did mattered not just for laughs, but for lives. He carried a new sense of mission that transformed not only him, but the culture around him. For Keanu, the outpouring of responses became deeply personal. He received letters written by hand, entire families sending photographs with notes saying, "You reminded us of what we lost," or "Your words healed us." Some wrote that they had given their hearts to Jesus for the first time while watching. Others said they had found the courage to forgive, to reconcile, to believe again. Keanu read them in quiet moments, humbled to tears. He had never set out to preach, but somehow his honesty about faith had become a spark of revival. The press nicknamed the broadcast the Miracle Episode. That title stuck. Months later, people were still watching and sharing it, long after typical television moments had been forgotten. It wasn't remembered for laughter or celebrity glamour, but for the night heaven seemed to touch earth in front of millions. And so, what began as a simple celebrity special of Family Feud became something timeless. Steve Harvey was changed forever. Keanu Reeves was seen not only as an actor, but as a vessel of faith, and millions of viewers across the globe carried away a reminder that God could show up anywhere, even on live television. The studio lights dimmed that night, but the glow of what happened never faded. What was meant to be an ordinary game show transformed into something extraordinary, a living reminder that God often chooses the most unexpected settings to reveal His presence. It wasn't in a pulpit or cathedral. It wasn't in a scripted sermon. It was on a television stage, in the middle of laughter and competition, where hearts broke open and heaven felt near. Keanu Reeves had not delivered a performance that evening. He had simply been himself, humble, quiet, steady. Yet his sincerity about faith cut through every distraction. His words about Jesus weren't wrapped in eloquence or performance. They were lived truths, born out of loss, pain, and surrender. And they carried the undeniable weight of authenticity. That was what made them powerful. Steve Harvey, a man who had spent his life in front of cameras, was stripped of his usual rhythm. For once, it wasn't about jokes or smooth transitions. It was about a raw, vulnerable encounter with God. Millions watched as he crumbled under the weight of love spoken through another man's testimony. His tears didn't weaken him. They revealed his humanity. They showed a world used to polished images that even public figures need reminders of God's embrace. This combination, Keanu's humility and Steve's openness, created something unforgettable. Together, they showed that no one is beyond the reach of grace. One man brought a quiet message of surrender. The other responded with public vulnerability. And the result was a moment that rippled across the globe. The Miracle Episode was not about fame. It was about faith. It was about what happens when people choose to listen, when they let go of appearances, and when they allow God to speak through them. And the lesson stretches beyond that night. It whispers to everyone who watched and everyone who hears the story today. If God could turn a celebrity game show into a revival, He can step into your life too. He is not limited by cameras, by stages, by scripts, or by settings. He is present in the laughter of families, in the silence of grief, in the chaos of daily struggles. His love breaks into the ordinary, transforming it into something extraordinary. You may not be standing on a stage like Steve Harvey, but their moment reminds us that God meets people right where they are. In living rooms, in hospital rooms, in traffic jams, in quiet kitchens, late at night. His presence is not bound by circumstance. It is bound only by His love, and His love never runs out. That is the legacy of what happened on that stage. Not applause, not headlines, not even viral clips. The true legacy is the reminder that hearts can change anywhere, anytime, when people make room for God. The image of Steve Harvey sobbing into his hands while Keanu Reeves stood steady beside him became a symbol of something greater than television. It showed the world that vulnerability is not weakness, that strength can be found in surrender, and that even those who seem to have everything still need God's love. Millions of people felt that moment in their own homes. They weren't in the studio, but they were touched as though they had been sitting in the front row. Families who rarely prayed found themselves bowing their heads. Men and women who had drifted far from faith felt a sudden tug to return. Skeptics who had turned away from God couldn't deny that something real had happened on that stage. And maybe that's the most powerful part of this story. It wasn't just about two celebrities having a private exchange. It was about the God who used them to reach countless lives. If He could use that moment to touch millions through a game show broadcast, imagine what He can do in your life right now. This is where the story turns toward you. You may be carrying questions that feel too heavy. You may be wondering if God notices you, if He sees your struggles, if He cares about the burdens you've been silently holding. What happened that night on Family Feud is a reminder that the answer is yes. He sees you. He knows you. He is closer than you realize. Keanu's humility and Steve's openness created space for God to move, but that same space can be created in your own life. It doesn't require cameras or applause. It simply requires a heart willing to open. Just as Keanu said, strength doesn't begin with pride. It begins on your knees. Just as Steve discovered, joy isn't found only in making people laugh. It's found in knowing you are loved by the one who made you. And so the invitation is simple. If this incredible story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope today. Someone you know may be carrying silent pain, wondering if God still remembers them. This story could be the spark that reminds them they are not forgotten. But more than sharing, reflect for yourself. Ask, have you ever felt God in an unexpected place? Maybe it was in a hospital hallway, or on a long drive, or in the middle of an ordinary day. Maybe it happened in laughter, or in grief, or in silence. He shows up where we least expect Him, not to condemn, but to love. That is the legacy of this moment, and that is the invitation for you right now. To believe that He can enter your story just as He entered theirs. To trust that He is closer than your next breath. And to remember that you are not forgotten. If this incredible story touched your heart, let it live beyond this screen. Share it. Comment below. Tell us where you have felt God in an unexpected place. Because your story, like Keanu's, like Steve's, may be the very thing someone else is waiting to hear.